I still remember the first time I saw her. She was just a shadow at first, standing behind a cracked window in that rotting house at the end of our street. Everyone in town called her the poor widow. No one really knew her name. No one really cared to. She had lived alone in that house for years. They said her husband died suddenly when she was still young, leaving her with nothing. No children, no family, just that old crumbling house and a lifetime of grief. People whispered that she never left her home, that she barely ate, that she spent her days talking to someone who wasn't there. I was a kid when I first noticed her. I remember walking home from school one evening and glancing toward her house. The curtains were open just enough for me to see her standing there staring out. Her face was pale, thin, her eyes sunken like she hadn't slept in years. I froze. She didn't move. She just stood there watching. After that, I started noticing strange things. Some nights, when everything was quiet, I'd hear crying coming from her house. Not soft sobs, deep, painful wailing, like someone was being torn apart from the inside. It sent chills through me, but my parents told me to ignore it. "That's just the widow," my mother said. "She's grieving. Leave her be." But it never stopped. Every night, the same horrible cries. One evening, I finally worked up the courage to go near her house. I don't know why, I just felt drawn to it. The air around it felt heavier, colder. The windows were covered in dust and the wooden walls were cracked and peeling. I stepped onto her porch, heart pounding. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door creaked open. She stood there looking at me with those hollow eyes. Up close, she looked even worse. Her skin was almost gray, her lips dry and cracked. But the worst part was the smell. It was faint, but something was wrong. It smelled like damp wood, old dust, and something else, something rotten. "You're the boy who watches," she whispered. I almost ran, but something in her voice made me stop. It wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening, it was just sad. I wasn't watching," I stammered. She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "You heard him too, didn't you?" I had no idea what she meant, but before I could answer, she turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open. Against all logic, I followed. The inside of her house was worse than I imagined. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But the smell, dear God, the smell was stronger in here. She walked to a small table and picked up something wrapped in an old stained cloth. She cradled it like a baby. "I lost them both," she whispered. I felt my stomach drop. "Both." She turned to me, her dead eyes wet with tears. "My husband and our son." I swallowed hard. No one ever mentioned a child. "He was stillborn," she continued, her voice shaking. "We buried him in the backyard. But my husband, he couldn't handle it. One night, he walked into the lake and never came back." I stepped back, suddenly wanting to leave, but her grip on the bundle tightened. "But they never really left me." Her lips trembled. "They talked to me every night. The wailing, the horrible, painful wailing. My body went cold." "Who talks to you?" She looked at me, her eyes dark and empty. "They do." At that moment, something thumped upstairs. Hard. I jumped. It was loud, heavy, like something huge had fallen. The widow didn't even flinch. She just turned her head slightly toward the ceiling. "They don't like strangers." My blood turned to ice. Something moved upstairs. I heard slow, dragging footsteps, followed by another loud thump. Then, a whisper, not from her, from upstairs. "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran. I didn't look back. I burst out of that house, ran down the street, and didn't stop until I reached home. That night, the wailing was louder than ever. It didn't stop until dawn. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My father's face went pale. My mother made the sign of the cross. That day, we left food outside her house, but she never came out to take it. No one ever saw her again. A week later, a terrible smell spread through the street. The police broke down her door. They found her sitting in that same chair, still holding that bundle. She had been dead for days. But here's the thing. The police also found 2 other bodies. One was her husband, his corpse half decayed, as if it had been sitting in that house for years. The other? a small rotting bundle wrapped in cloth, the exact one she had been holding. I don't walk past that house anymore, and at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear the crying.